Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm Chris Bianchi. We've been tracking the Alex Ewing case over the last 2 weeks. If you're unfamiliar at this point, this is the case in the 1984 brutal murders of Deborah and Bruce Bennett and their 7-year-old daughter, Melissa. And if you've been joining us here over the course of the last 2 weeks over the course of the trial, you may know at this point that Alex Ewing was found guilty on all counts today. And at the courthouse every day has been 9 Wants to Know investigative reporter Kevin Vaughan, and tracking this case as well as 9 News' director of investigative reporting Nicole Vapp, both of whom join us now for a bit more on this. And Kevin, I'm going to go straight to you. You were at the courthouse over the course of the last 2 weeks. Guilty verdict comes in today from after 8-9 hours or so deliberations from the jury. Your initial thoughts and initial reactions from some of those involved.
Well, first of all, yesterday ended with the jury saying that they were at an impasse with, I think the words were little possibility of being able to get through that, which suggested they were going to be hung and suggested there would be a mistrial. The judge was reluctant to call for a mistrial at that point. They'd only been deliberating about 3.5 hours. And so he gave them, an instruction that's given usually in these kinds of cases, suggested that they go back, continue to consider the evidence, listen to one another, deliberate, hold true to their own convictions, and that they were the ones, to find the truth here. And he sent them home for the night, told them to go home, get a good night rest, come back tomorrow morning and start deliberating again. So, they were back in the jury room around 8:30 this morning. And I sort of thought that, not knowing anything about how bad this impasse was, what this impasse was, but I thought that it was likely that they would be back there for an hour or two and then would come out and tell the judge that they could not break the deadlock. And in Colorado, juries on felony trials have to be unanimous. So if it was 11-1 in favor of conviction, it would have been a hung jury and a mistrial, and the prosecution would have had an opportunity to try the case again. And then as more time went on and, it got to be 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, noon came around, the jurors ordered lunch. And it seemed to me that they were taking a really careful look at all the evidence. They had a couple of hundred exhibits introduced, everything from crime scene photographs to documents and other things. They had the testimony of 30, more than 30 witnesses to consider. So I was thinking, well, I think perhaps they're going through everything really carefully. And then suddenly it got to be 2 o'clock or close to 2 o'clock, and I was starting to imagine that it might go through the day without a verdict today. And then we got the word there's a verdict, and we were in the courtroom. And, Connie Bennett, we've talked a lot about her. She's been the face of her family's tragedy since the day it happened. It was she who went to her son's house and found his body and discovered this horrible crime scene. She was the first witness called by the prosecution. And she did not let out visible emotion in the courtroom, but as soon as the jury was released and District Attorney John Kellner gave her a hug, she became very emotional, and she spoke to us for just a short time. She didn't want to take any questions, but she, said that she felt like a huge weight had been lifted, and I can only imagine that that's exactly what it felt like for her.
I can't even imagine after 37 years what this must be like, especially when she was probably wondering for most of those years, if they would ever find the person.
Yeah, right. You're right. Nicole, if you think back to 2018, when we broke the story that there was a suspect in this case, that they had a DNA match and they were looking at a suspect in this case. You'll remember that I called Connie, and I'm just pulling up her exact words here. She said to me, a little bit of searching on live TV, but she said essentially that for a long time I would have hoped that I would live long enough to see somebody caught. And she said, I don't know, I don't want to know the why. There is no why, but she said, I want to know the who. And I hope to live long enough to see that. And, she's 87. She's obviously mentally totally with it. And today she got to see that. And I can only imagine, what she feels like maybe almost like she's let out a breath she's been holding for 37 and a half years.
And she said there is no closure for
She has
something
said
like
that.
this.
Yeah. She said, I don't know what that is. That'll never be over for me. It'll never be closed for me. Um,
But it must be nice to know that at least the person who did it is now going to be held responsible. And, um, you know, the jury didn't know that he was in prison for something else, but at least she knows that he wasn't out living his life this whole time. That must be of some comfort,
yeah, she
even
has told me
though,
that in the past that was some comfort to know that he was behind bars and could not hurt somebody. And just to remind people, he was serving a 110-year sentence in Nevada for a middle of the night axe handle attack on a couple in the town of Henderson that occurred later that same year that the Bennetts were killed, 1984. And that's where he was when his DNA was added to the FBI's national database, which immediately led to a hit on the Bennett case and on the murder of Patricia Smith in Lakewood. He is scheduled to go on trial for that in October in Jefferson County. So, yeah, he
and I
has
will tell
not been
people,
out on the streets. He's been in prison, and
mhm,
now he's going to be there longer.
and I will tell people that episode of our podcast is, I mean, I'm biased, but is really interesting because you're hearing from the woman who was attacked and you're hearing the 911 call. And so someone who survived one of his attacks who could remember it, where Vanessa, the 3-year-old in the Bennett family, she doesn't remember any of it. So here's a woman who remembers what he said, what he looked like, and what he was doing. And so to hear that, you get a little frame of reference of what maybe these folks here in Colorado went through when they had their attacks here. So that, do you remember which episode that is?
I don't remember which episode, but we
It's
did.
also good.
Yeah, but we did travel to Anna Houston and I traveled to Arizona and Nevada last year, pre-pandemic, and we talked to a man that Ewing was accused of attacking in Kingman, Arizona, in the middle of the night. The charges in that case were eventually dropped because he was subsequently sentenced to those 110 years that I talked about for the attack in Henderson. We talked to the victim in that case. We talked to a police officer who responded to that case. We talked to the attorney who prosecuted him, and we talked to a park ranger who arrested him for that attack and was stunned to find out about his implication in these murders in Colorado. So this is all stuff the jury did not know. They really knew. They knew his DNA was tied to this other murder in Lakewood, but they didn't know he hadn't gone on trial yet. They didn't know if he'd gone to jail for it or hadn't gone to jail or whatever. And they didn't know anything about his legal issues in Nevada and Arizona or a number of other pieces of evidence related to him. So interesting case, and just an emotional day for Connie Bennett. She was flanked by two of her daughters. So she has 5 children. Of course, her middle son Bruce was murdered in this terrible crime, but she was flanked by 3 of her 4 surviving children in court today. There was another woman there who was a victim of a hammer attack in the middle of the night in Aurora in 1974. Ewing is, police believe Ewing was responsible for that one. He's never been charged. The statute of
1984?
limitations. Yeah, 1984. Sorry.
I was
The
gonna say,
the the statute of limitations, had long since lapsed in that case. But she was there today. There was a woman there today who was next door neighbors of the woman who was killed in Lakewood. Was an 11-year-old girl at that time. She came today, wanted to see what happened. In fact, she and I spent most of the time we were waiting for the verdict chatting about this. So there was a lot of emotion in that courtroom and a lot of emotion in Connie when she talked to us afterwards. And like I said, she was clear a weight had been lifted. She used those exact words, and said that she feels like this is going to mean something going forward, and mean something to her family, that this has been resolved, and that they now have a conviction of the man who took so much away from them.
I hope that maybe we can sit down and do a longer interview with her at some point, and learn a little bit more about how this process has been, including what happened in the last 24 hours. And so I don't want to lose sight of that. She must have gone home last night thinking, what is happening after all this time? And they say they're at an impasse. Did anyone speculate, anyone talk about it today? Any of the attorneys about what may have been happening?
Yeah, I asked the district attorney, John Kellner, about that exact point. I said, "What did you think when you got this news?" And he said, "Well, look, I thought that this has been an emotional couple of weeks. This is an emotional subject. The pictures are disturbing." And he said, "I just kept thinking that they needed to get away from here, get a good night's sleep, and come back, and fresh, and that they would be able to do their job." And I have to tell you, I talked to a number of people last night after that, and a lot of people were nervous that this was headed to a mistrial. And if there'd been a mistrial, they could have tried him again. It's no issue, but it would have been months down the road, probably in 2022, given the backups in the courts over COVID, and the fact that Ewing has to go on trial in October in the other case. So I imagine that a lot of people didn't sleep very well last night associated with this case, I imagine.
Yeah, and I'm also curious at some point to hear from Vanessa, who's obviously her life has been about this her entire life, and she has been haunted by this act and the loss of her family. And Connie has talked extensively about and Vanessa, so it'll be interesting to hear from her as well at some point.
Yes, we think Vanessa does not live in Colorado. She came here for the start of the trial, and she did testify. But we think she's going to be back for the sentencing, which is scheduled in 11 days' time, so a week and a half. One of the things about this that's been a little bit difficult from just a standpoint of reporting it is that Vanessa is almost a forgotten person in this case now, because she lived. And so there were a number of charges originally filed against Alex Ewing because she was beaten with a hammer. She was horribly injured. She suffered a brain injury and a number of other injuries. She's still dealing with the lingering effects of those injuries all these years later. But all of the charges that involved what was done to her have been dropped because of the statute of limitations. So this trial was only about the deaths, the murders of Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, and Vanessa's older sister, Melissa. And, Vanessa was, just like I said, almost an afterthought. And I can imagine there's going to be great satisfaction. I expect I'll be talking to her fairly soon. I expect I'll be talking to Connie in more depth fairly soon. There was an interesting scene outside the courthouse. The jurors were all outside, I think, sort of visiting with each other, and because they probably have some bonds now. I mean, they spent 2 weeks looking at the evidence in this case, and 2 days in a small room trying to sort out what all that evidence means. And so they were talking, and Connie and her family came out, and they sort of tentatively approached some of the jurors, and there was some conversations that went on, and some hugs. And so that was an interesting thing. Jurors, for people who don't know, once they're released from jury duty, a judge tells them basically they're free to talk to anybody they want to talk to, or to not talk to anybody they don't want to talk to. And so it looked to me from across the parking lot that they were totally comfortable doing, having some contact with Connie. Of course, they had heard her testimony on the first day, very emotional. So it was a day. It was quite a day today.
Well, and of course, I know you gave out business cards to some of the jurors. If any of them are watching and they want to talk about what happened in there, we'd certainly love to hear from them, and hear more about what happened in that jury room, not to name names or anything, but just to kind of understand what it must have been like to go through this whole ordeal for a
Sure, and
couple of years.
they had a hard job, and
Yeah.
yeah, and I can only imagine. You know, we see a lot of things by virtue of the kind of work we do, and I can imagine for a lot of these people, the images that they saw, the crime scene photographs and the video, and the information that was shared with them about the injuries inflicted on this couple and their young daughter. It had to be hard. I mean, it had to be really hard for them, and they have a hard job, and you know, they're sort of the bedrock of the system that we have.
You know, we sometimes forget that jurors are out there serving our democracy every
Yeah,
day,
exactly, exactly.
and it can be a very hard job, and it's a sacrifice, but it's good that they're out there doing this. So,
Yeah, yeah.
well, we'll let you get to your story.
Okay.
Kevin's working on a story for tonight, so you can see, uh, uh, what Connie had to say and everything. So, Chris, until the next time.
Yeah, and Kevin and Nicole, we certainly appreciate that. That was a fascinating conversation. Obviously, quite the day, as you mentioned there, Kevin, in terms of what we saw. But of course, the case now does have a conclusion, with Alex Ewing convicted on all 6 charges. So we appreciate all your time. And by the way, Nicole, you referenced the podcast a few times in there. The podcast, the 11-part podcast, is Blame the Fear All These Years. That is available on Apple Podcasts as well as at 9news.com/blame. So a couple ways to read up on this case or to hear about this case if you are unfamiliar with all of it. But Kevin, Nicole, it's been an interesting 2 weeks nonetheless. And as you mentioned there, we'll see you next time. So thanks so much for all your insight over the last few weeks.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much.